everybody, you're here with Luminol on the Wall. I'm Becky. And today I'm flying solo. And if you've been listening to any of our other podcasts, you would know that my lovely younger sister has been pregnant for, well, it seemed like forever. But yes, she had her baby. So she's a little preoccupied and shan't be joining us for our podcast for a couple weeks. I know we're all going to miss her greatly and our sister chats and our banter, but I can assure you she is dying to get back as soon as she's feeling up to it. So with that being said, I'm just going to be really honest with you all. I'm a little bit nervous to do this podcast without my sister for several reasons, but the number one is our sound quality. My sister is pretty much in charge of our sound and editing, and I do the writing and podcast editing. So I hope I do her justice, and I hope you guys aren't like sitting in your car screaming at me being like, damn, their sound quality went to shit. So if it is, I'm just going to apologize now because I truly gave it my best effort. And let's just pray to God that Bev's 3-minute tutorial was all I needed. So without further ado, let's get into the case. So today we are heading to central Canada to the city of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. On March 25th, 2015, around 6 a.m., a gentleman just happened to be walking along the southern outskirts of one of the landfills in Saskatoon when he noticed something just off to the side of the road. When he approached, he realized it was a woman, and when he got closer, she was unresponsive and was already cold to the touch. So the man immediately called 911 to report what he had found. When the police arrived, they noticed that this young woman had blood on the hood of her leather jacket and had several markings on her neck. She had no shoes on, and her watch was smashed to pieces. And they quickly realized this was no accident and that there had been a rather violent struggle. Not too far away from the body, they found a thick woven black belt with a large buckle. One of the classic chunky belts that, a lot of women my age wore often in the early 2000s. Besides this belt, there wasn't a ton of evidence at the scene. And unfortunately, the woman had no identification on her. So figuring out who this woman was their first priority. So in an effort to identify this woman, police released photos of the clothing she was wearing and 2 distinctive tattoos, a big detailed lion head and some stars. They were hoping that someone would recognize her and come forward. And luckily, it didn't take very long before police received a phone call from a pretty upset woman named Cheyenne Antoine. She told the police that her friend Brittany Gargle had those tattoos. Several other people also called in, identifying the tattoos as belonging to Brittany Gargle. Because all these people called in, the police were officially able to identify the victim as Brittany Gargle, and her death was now officially labeled a homicide. So, just who was Brittany Gargle? She was born August 31st, 1996 in Saskatoon. She was born and raised there, and when she was little, her parents separated. Her father went on to have 4 other daughters, and it was only in the last few years of Brittany's life that she had reconnected with him and grew close to her younger sisters. They spent a lot of time together, and the girls really looked up to Brittany. She was described as outspoken and opinionated. She had a great sense of humor. She was very adventurous. She loved camping, boating, and snowboarding, and she always had friends around her. Now, Brittany had dropped out of high school, but one of her friends, Natasha, who later came forward to the police, had been the one to convince her to go back to get her diploma. And by 2015, Brittany was 18 years old. She was working 2 jobs to save money and had just re-enrolled in school. Her dream was to eventually go to university for business and work in the hospitality industry. And just maybe one day she would own her own hotel. So she clearly had a bright future. But the question is, how does someone with such a bright future wind up in a ditch dead? In order to figure that out, investigators start talking to Brittany's friends and family. And they learned that earlier on March 24th, Brittany was hanging out with one of her friends, Natasha, and she had told her that she was going to a party that evening with Cheyenne Antoine and some other friends. Now, you see, Brittany and Cheyenne were the best of friends. The two were incredibly close and spent a ton of time together. Some would describe them as almost sister-like. The pair had become even closer after Cheyenne shared some of her traumatic childhood and teen years with Brittany. Brittany became Cheyenne's biggest support system from that point on. So when investigators find out that Brittany had been out partying with Cheyenne, they obviously want to speak with her. And when they did, she told them that the night started out like many others. The two women got ready together, they took a bunch of photos, made a quick Facebook post, and headed off for the evening. She said they started at the Manchester Brew Pub, then made their way to a party, and then eventually made their way to the Colonial Pub and Grill. Cheyenne said by the time they got there, they were both fairly intoxicated, and her memory seemed to be a little blurry. However, she told the investigators she specifically remembered Brittany meeting a man at the bar. They chatted for a short time, and then she had invited him to come have a drink with them, and they seemed to be getting along really well. Cheyenne told the investigators that Brittany and the man eventually left together around 4 a.m., but she hadn't got the man's name, nor did she remember what he looked like. She only remembered him being a young Caucasian male. Cheyenne also didn't know where they were going or how they were getting there. She did tell the investigators that after Brittany left the bar, she realized that Brittany had her phone in her purse, and she had no way of getting a hold of Brittany or anyone else for that matter. And not long after, Cheyenne also decided to leave the bar, and she made it safely home to her uncle's house. From that point, she started getting pretty worried about Brittany. And because she didn't have her phone, she decided to log onto the computer and go onto Facebook. And she sent Brittany a message that said, "Where are you? Haven't heard from you. Hope you made it home safe. Love ya." And from that point on, Cheyenne never heard from Brittany again. So after talking with Cheyenne and hearing the series of events from the evening, investigators feel that they have a pretty good starting point. So they go and they gather security footage from the Colonial Pub where Cheyenne said they had been last. They also spoke with staff to see if they could be of any help. But what was really interesting is not a single staff member recalled seeing Brittany, Cheyenne, or this mystery man. And after hours and hours of footage had been reviewed, not one of the three people they had been looking for could be seen on any of their security footage. They also noticed that Brittany's car could not be seen in any of the footage either. This was all very surprising to the investigators, but the pub was pretty busy that night, so they decided to go over the footage multiple times just in case they missed something. However, every time they came up empty-handed, and that's when they really started to question Cheyenne's series of events. Because there is absolutely no way that Cheyenne and Brittany were not on the security footage unless they had not been there in the first place. Now, police feel that they just were sent on this wild goose chase. And this sucks because it also leaves them with no real direction to go in. But that didn't last long because Brittany's car was found shortly after. Now, in all my research, I could not find where her car was found. But I assume it is somewhere rural and grassy because when the car was found, there was grass wedged in the wheel well, and it was covered in dust and dirt. The investigators noticed on the side of the car that there was some black scuff marks on the door. Now, inside the vehicle, investigators found Cheyenne's cell phone. And based on Cheyenne's original story, this makes sense. But we know that the investigators have virtually debunked Cheyenne's original story because they weren't on the security footage at the bar. So this makes investigators reconsider why this cell phone was in Brittany's car. So in order to get a bit more insight into the events of the evening, they examined Cheyenne's phone location history. And they saw that it had pinged at a McDonald's at 4:30 a.m. on March 25th, leading them to wonder, was Cheyenne with Brittany at that time? Regardless of the answer, they had no way of knowing because that's kind of where the evidence trail stops. You know, investigators have serious concern that Cheyenne is involved in Brittany's murder, but they have zero evidence supporting that she was involved, but they also have zero evidence supporting she wasn't. So arguably, the investigation is moving on pretty slow. But eventually, Brittany's autopsy came back, and they were able to determine that Brittany had been strangled to death. And based on the markings and patterns on her neck, it was determined that that thick black belt found near her body was the murder weapon. They were also able to say that the dark scuff marks on Brittany's car had been caused by that same belt. So months went by with no new leads, and by September 2015, 6 months after Brittany's death, the case was cold. They just didn't have much evidence to go on, so investigators decide to re-interview Cheyenne's uncle, who had initially been very cooperative and had told them that, yes, Cheyenne did show up at his house alone on the morning of March 25th. But this time, he was fairly evasive. But with a little bit of pressure, he finally broke down and admitted that Cheyenne had told him a completely different story than what she told the police. According to her uncle, Cheyenne said that she and Brittany had met 2 black men at the bar. They had gone back to a motel with them where they smoked weed, and then, for some reason, they got into an argument over cocaine. Cheyenne claimed that she went to the bathroom, and when she came out, Brittany was dead. Strangled, in fact. She said the 2 men pulled a gun on her and forced her to help cover up the crime. This, of course, was a pretty stark contrast to her original story. Investigators realized that when Cheyenne had called in to identify Brittany's tattoos and clothing, she already knew her friend was dead. And this just felt really eerie to them. Why would she not have called to report this murder after she had gotten to safety? So with this newfound information, investigators wanted to re-interview Cheyenne. Lucky for them, she was pretty easy to track down because she was in jail on another charge. Turns out Cheyenne had a long rap sheet with over 50 convictions since the age of 12. When they went to go question Cheyenne, she actually refused to speak about that evening. And once again, investigators were stuck in limbo land. They had no motive and no clear understanding of what had really happened that night. The only thing they do know is that their intuition about Cheyenne is becoming stronger and stronger, and that she was involved and knew a lot more than she was telling anyone. Regardless of their intuition, though, they needed some cold, hard evidence. And they decided to scour Cheyenne and Brittany's social media accounts, just hoping that they would find something they missed the first time around. They read through thousands of messages and searched through thousands of photos, hoping to find some clue of a fight or a feud between the 2 girls. But all they found were typical back and forths between close friends. And just as they were feeling hopeless and defeated, they actually found something. A tribute photo Cheyenne had uploaded. It was a selfie of the 2 girls taken the night of March 24th. And in the bottom corner of the picture, they could barely see that Cheyenne was wearing the thick, woven black belt, and it appeared to be the same belt found near Brittany's body. This felt like a really lucky break, and they realized just how lucky, because if the photo had been just an inch higher, they would have never known Cheyenne wore that belt out that night. So because of this super tiny piece of evidence, they were able to send the belt for DNA testing. And sure enough, it came back positive for both Brittany and Cheyenne's DNA. But still, investigators knew that evidence alone was not strong enough to bring anything to trial. That kind of evidence is something that the defense attorneys could easily explain why Cheyenne's DNA was on that belt, but that she did not kill Brittany. So everyone waited to lay charges. Everyone waited and waited until almost 2 years after Brittany's death. A friend of Cheyenne's came forward. She apparently showed up at Brittany's parents' house, and she was overwhelmed with guilt. And she had an unimaginable story to tell. She said that in the early morning of March 25th, 2015, Cheyenne showed up at her house. She was completely hammered. She was crying and hysterical. She confessed that she and Brittany had gotten into a heated argument over a cell phone. Cheyenne admitted that in a rage, she hit and then choked Brittany to death with her belt. The friend said Cheyenne then pointed outside, and there in Brittany's car, she saw Brittany slumped over in the passenger seat.
Hello, my name is Kristen Riguidel, and I'm a licensed insurance broker across Canada and in the United States. But I want to ask you a question. Is life super predictable? No, there's always going to be curveballs in life, but there's 2 things that I can guarantee you. 1, we're all gonna have to pay taxes, and 2, we're all gonna die. I know, it's morbid, right? But it's true. And that's where life insurance comes in. Life insurance is a selfless act. At the end of the day, it's meant for your loved ones in the event you were to pass away unexpectedly. And not that money can ever replace us, but I always liked the idea of leaving some money behind for my brothers, whether that be for their college education, or a down payment on a house, or even just time off of work to grieve. Because the last thing I would want for my family is to have to go to work and pay the bills while they're grieving. And so life insurance gives you the peace of mind that no matter when you pass away, your loved ones are taken care of. With flexible plans, affordable premiums, and coverage that fits your unique needs, I do the shopping around for you so that you can get the protection without the hassle. Because taking care of your future doesn't have to be complicated. If you'd like to discuss options, you can send me an email at kriguidel15lrxc@wfgmail.ca or give me a phone call at 403-785-7670 to learn more and get a free quote today so you can live tomorrow with peace of mind.
She was completely terrified, and she told Cheyenne to leave. The following morning, when she confronted Cheyenne again, Cheyenne claimed she didn't remember anything and that she was too drunk. For 2 years, this friend kept the secret. But the guilt finally became too much, and this seemed to be the catalyst they needed, because after this, others came clean too. Cheyenne's uncle admitted she had asked him to help create an alibi for her. Now, what surprises investigators about this all is that on several occasions, Cheyenne admitted being very drunk that evening and not being able to remember the events of the evening. But she had the wherewithal to ask her uncle for help creating an alibi. She obviously was aware that she had done something wrong, because otherwise, why would you make up false stories of the evening, such as the mystery man at the bar or the 2 black men in the hotel room? It just doesn't make sense if you were truly too intoxicated to remember the events of the evening. So with everything they now had, they decided to arrest and charge Cheyenne Antoine in March of 2017. Cheyenne was charged with second-degree murder and indignity to a body. And now that she was arrested, Cheyenne agreed to tell her version of what happened that night. She told investigators that her and Brittany had been partying pretty hard at the house party, but after that, her memories seemed to be a bit hazy. However, she remembered going to McDonald's, where she said an argument started between her and Brittany. They had been walking when Brittany all of a sudden ripped the cell phone out of Cheyenne's hands, and she became furious. And Cheyenne said she just snapped. But she couldn't recall the exact sequence of events, but when she came to, Brittany was lying unconscious on the ground. So once again, Cheyenne's memory was too hazy to recall the details of the crime. You know, maybe I'm just being really cynical about Cheyenne, and maybe she was too damn drunk and had lapses in her memory. I don't know, but to me, it just seems like she is not wanting to take full responsibility or accountability to her crime. Anyways, as I said earlier, Cheyenne was charged with second-degree murder. And in Canada, that carries a life sentence with the possibility of parole. So the options are kind of endless based on the courts. Now, if Cheyenne went to trial, she could face up to life in prison. But after discussing with her lawyers, she agreed to plead guilty to manslaughter and avoid a trial altogether. In the court at sentencing, Cheyenne released a statement through her lawyer. It said, "I will never forgive myself. Nothing I say or do will ever bring her back. I'm very sorry. It shouldn't have ever happened." Yeah, that is the truth. During the sentencing, Cheyenne's lawyers asked for leniency in regards to her sentencing. They highlighted her traumatic past. Her parents, who had been survivors of Canadian residential schools, carried forward a lot of trauma and struggled with substance abuse. Because of this, Cheyenne was placed in foster care at a young age, where she was physically, sexually, and emotionally abused. At 14, she had reconnected with her mother, only to lose her a year later. 1 month before Brittany's death, Cheyenne had been sexually assaulted and began heavily abusing alcohol and methamphetamine. So hearing all that, yeah, I feel really bad that that was Cheyenne's life growing up and that she had to experience all that nonsense, like no child ever deserves to grow up like that. That is true. At the end of the day, though, you know right from wrong, and you killed your best friend, and that is wrong as can be. And then on top of it, you lied to try and cover it up so that no one would catch on that you were responsible for this. So, do I think that the judge should be lenient? Not really. But the judge, in this case, did show leniency. And Cheyenne was sentenced to 7 years in prison for Brittany's death. The judge also ordered her to attend a mandatory prison drug rehabilitation program. Cheyenne's time in prison was filled with a lot of ups and downs, but in June 2020, she was granted day parole. But only 4 months later, her parole was revoked because she had overdosed and violated almost every condition of her parole, and she was sent back to prison. The following year, in 2021, she was granted day parole again, but after completing a mandatory 6-week intensive addiction program, she went AWOL and was arrested again for breaching her conditions. Then while back in prison, in March of 2022, she attacked a correctional officer with her fists. She did this because she was told that she was not allowed to have a shower at that moment. This, unfortunately, was one of 15 serious institutional charges that she received. She had also incurred an additional 44 minor charges for disobeying institutional rules, like being disrespectful, threatening staff and other inmates, refusing urine analysis, possession of contraband, and diverting medication. So because of all these incidences, in 2023, Cheyenne was denied full parole. Even though she completed several Indigenous healing programs and self-management classes, the parole board ultimately ruled her too high a risk to reoffend. But in May 2024, just a year ago, based on Canadian law, she was granted statutory release. Now, this is slightly different than parole, because inmates who have not been charged with first or second degree murder and are in there for life automatically get to be reviewed for release after 2/3 of their sentence have been served. So because that was the case, Cheyenne was released. But just like parole, she had conditions. One of them was that she was ordered to attend an addiction treatment center for women called Aventa in Calgary, Alberta. However, when she arrived, she was found with drug supplies and amphetamines in her system, and she ended up leaving treatment within a day or two, and she went on the run. She went completely AWOL. And later, on June 2nd, 2024, Cheyenne was arrested again after committing 2 carjackings and leading the police on a high-speed chase through the streets of Calgary. So after that, she faced new charges for robbery, flight from police, dangerous driving, and resisting arrest, and was sent back to prison. On January 13th of 2025, it was ruled by the parole board that Cheyenne Antoine's statutory release was revoked. She was deemed too high of a risk for reoffending, and that living amongst the community was not safe for the public or her. In this meeting, Cheyenne told the parole board that after leaving Aventa, she was living on the streets of Calgary and using drugs pretty heavily over the month she was at large. She reported overdosing on more than one occasion, waking up in the hospital and fleeing before she could be apprehended. She had told her parole officer that the morning she was arrested, she had called the police to turn herself in and had told them to come and pick her up, but they refused. With the statement, it almost seemed like Cheyenne was blaming her actions on the inaction of the police. So the parole board felt like Cheyenne wasn't really taking responsibility for her actions. They said, and I quote, "You state that they refused, so you felt you had to steal the vehicles to turn yourself in. You repeatedly justified your actions by stating you had no other choice, and that the system set you up for failure and eventually hung up on your parole officer." And ultimately, in January of 2025, just this year, the parole board revoked Cheyenne's statutory release, citing her as an unimaginable risk to the public. Her statutory release will be reviewed at a later date. Now, Cheyenne's original sentence of 7 years made Brittany's family feel like it really didn't reflect the brutality of the crime. The public was also outraged, and many people couldn't believe that a young woman's life was taken and her killer was only sentenced to 7 years. Because Brittany's death left an unfillable void for her family and friends. And years later, those who loved her continue to honor her memory, fighting for justice, change, and the belief that her life and her loss will never be forgotten. And my heart truly goes out to Brittany Gargle's family and anyone who misses her. I can't imagine a loss like that and having to live with that. So, like I said, my heart goes out to you, and I hope that your amazing memories of her never fade. This case is also a sad reminder that trauma and addiction is passed down through generations. And although people know right from wrong, when they're addicted to drugs and alcohol, it changes who they are and the decisions that they will make. You know, they're not always in the right frame of mind. And in no way am I excusing what Cheyenne did, but if she had not been under the influence, maybe this would have never happened. Maybe she wouldn't have killed her best friend and her biggest supporter. So that's all I have for you all today. So thank you for being here with me on my first solo endeavor. Have a good one.
And just your weekly reminder to download our weekly episodes, follow us on Spotify or Apple Music or whatever streaming platform you listen to us on, and give us a follow on our social medias. You can find us at Luminol on the Wall. Can't wait till next week.